Gray is also co-editor of several books, such as People Power in an Era of Global Crisis, Rebellion, Resistance, and Liberation, which was published by Routledge in 2012, Rising Powers and the Future of Global Governance, again published by Routledge in 2013, and finally, Rising Powers and South-South Cooperation, again published by Routledge in 2017. So today, Professor Gray will talk about around 35 minutes, and then this will be followed by brief comments and questions from the chair. And after that, we'll open up for more discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Professor Gray to start his lecture. Professor Gray, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So the first thing I need to do is share my screen. And I should know how to do this by now. So there you go. Is that visible now?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you very much for that introduction. It's very nice to be in Edinburgh virtually, if not in reality. But so I've been invited to talk about my book, which is coming out in April. It's a 350-page book, so it's not an easy book to summarize without focusing on certain themes at the expense of other themes. But in any case, I think maybe the best place to start would be just to talk about why I and my co-author, Lee Jong-un, decided to write this book, which was really that we were kind of unsatisfied with or dissatisfied with quite a lot of the literature on North Korean political economy and what we saw as a failure of that literature to really properly situate the country's experience within the broader world historical context of global development. And we can see this if we look at the kind of theoretical assumptions that existing research on North Korean development kind of utilize. I mean, primarily, they typically utilize a kind of neoclassical economics approach, either explicitly or sometimes implicitly, being on the face of it theoryless, but in reality, you can see that a lot of the assumptions are drawn from neoclassical economics. And so this approach typically, I mean, obviously it's much broader than North Korea. So it typically looks at developmental crises or impasses in the third world as being a result of market imperfections, which usually result from state intervention. So in the case of a state socialist country, like North Korea, there's a particular emphasis on autarky and on central planning as being responsible for this crisis of development. So this is really just mainstream economic theory, and on its own terms, of course, it is convincing as a critique, but it does suffer from a number of shortcomings, which is, just to put it very briefly, it doesn't provide a sort of convincing, theoretically informed explanation of why North Korea was, by the 1960s, actually able to achieve a significant degree of industrialization. I mean, at that time, it was, after Japan, probably the most industrialized country in East Asia. So we can see that these kind of approaches, they critique, but they fail to explain the real paradox of the North Korean experience. And I'd also say that the approach is kind of what you could say is methodologically nationalist, right? Because it focuses on the internal attributes of a particular country in question, whether North Korea or somewhere else, but doesn't really see how those internal attributes are shaped by, and indeed in some sense mutually constitutive with, what we might call the international, or more precisely, geopolitics. So an alternative approach was particularly popular in the 70s and the 80s was dependency theory, which does seek to situate third world development within the international context. And it argues that third world countries are undeveloped not just because of their own policy failings, but they are actively underdeveloped through the exploitative relations between those countries and the countries of the core of the world economy. Right. So the policy kind of advice that came out of this was that if countries of the global south really wanted to develop, well, what they needed to do was to kind of cut themselves off from the world economy, which was exploitative, and pursue a strategy of delinking and self-reliance. Now, this, of course, sounds very much like North Korean strategy in the post-war era. And so the argument was that, you could make this argument up until the 70s that North Korea's successful and very rapid industrialization was precisely a result of its strategy of autarky and self-reliance. And in the 70s, you had left-leaning scholars like John Halliday and Ada Foster Carter and people who argued that this was the case. And then you could compare North Korea to South Korea, which was considered as a unsuccessful case, and it was kind of neo-colonial development, all that kind of thing. But you could only really argue this up until about the 70s. By the 80s, it was clear that North Korea was struggling and South Korea was doing much better. And then because of that, this whole notion of dependency doesn't really make sense when you realize that you have to explain the early successes of North Korean development, but then its later problems. So some scholars have since then tried to use dependency to explain North Korea's contemporary relations with China. There it might have a bit more purchase. But there is a kind of a real problem there in that the theory tries to kind of present a generalized universal concept of dependency without actually considering how such relations are geopolitically constituted. So those are the weaknesses of what we would say are the main theoretical approaches to economic development in North Korea. In the book, we don't really try to present a full-blown alternative theory, but we do provide an alternative analytical approach, which comes under the title of the developmental geopolitics nexus. And so it's really just a way to think about how we cannot explain development without thinking about geopolitics and how the two shape each other. So, I mean, we set this out through a sort of narrative of global development, and then that raises some research questions that we then apply to the North Korean case. Now, I can only really just give an overview of the very sort of bare bones of this, but it starts off with a particular emphasis on the colonial era and colonial legacies and how that affected North Korean development. I mean, I think the literature typically regards North Korean development as an instance of state socialism, and state socialism is the framework which is used. But what we try to do is, well, I mean, this is true in some regards, but we really also need to understand it as a case of post-colonial catch-up industrialization. And then there's comparatively that situates it in a much broader kind of set of countries. And we show how in the Korean case, the North Korean case, that colonialism was a profoundly formative experience, not only in terms of, I mean, you're probably familiar with this in terms of South Korean development, but there's theories of colonial modernization, which are somewhat controversial, and we're not trying to sort of, celebrate this or anything, but to say that there was, particularly in the northern part of Korea, real legacies of industrialization that had an important impact on the post-1945 era. But it was also really crucial in terms of establishing a sort of developmental nationalism, but also a kind of industrialism as a kind of catch-up dominant hegemonic ideology. So there is, comparatively speaking, a good case for arguing that North Korea, amongst the post-colonial countries, probably had the most developed industrial basis, but that had impacts on its post-liberation development in positive and negative ways. So that's the colonial era. And then there's the, you know, thinking about the geopolitics in the post 1945 and post-war era, we draw attention to particularly North Korea's relation with the emerging Cold War, and particularly the role that external aid played in building upon that colonial basis. Because of course, I mean, we know this from the South Korean case, but also in North Korea. I mean, North Korea probably received more aid per capita than the South did. So it had an extremely profound impact on its development, and also making possible this continued kind of emphasis on particularly heavy industrialization. I mean, this was common to many state socialist countries, but in the North Korean context, its position on the front line of the Asian Cold War made that a real possibility. So you do see then this probably unparalleled in world history, extremely massive and rapid transition in the 1950s from a war-torn, you know, largely rural economy towards a industrialized, you might say over-industrialized kind of country, which had parallels probably much more with the countries of in this respect of the more advanced countries of Eastern Europe, rather than say China and Vietnam. So, you know, I'm skipping over a lot. I mean, obviously in the book, there's a much more empirical detail about how all this worked, but this is the sort of broad lines of the overall argument. I should just say, we're not saying that geopolitical context simply determines development. I mean, this is kind of mediated through domestic social and political forces. So we look, for example, at the, I mean, it's well known in some respects, but the factional struggles in the 1950s were very much also struggles about the correct approach towards development. So there were debates and conflicts over developmental strategy. And the fact that the Manchurian partisan guerrillas led by Kim Il-sung, his faction, you know, prevailed in these struggles, obviously had a very important impact in terms of how geopolitical challenges were interpreted. And of course, they were interpreted in a sort of security first kind of manner. So geopolitical context then kind of continues to play this very important role. So that there is kind of basically the first sort of 4 chapters of the book. So, but to summarize, you know, we apply this to look at the development of the political economy up until the 1990s, and it produced an economy that was in many respects overdeveloped and over-industrialized, albeit, of course, as we see in the 90s, with forms of dependence on external energy supplies. I mean, I say dependence, but I don't necessarily mean that in the sense of dependency theory, because, you know, dependency theory regards dependency as an exploitative relation. But I think given that North Korea was able to actually build up a quite advanced industrial economy through its external support, that seems a very odd form of exploitation. But what does this tell us then? I mean, it tells us that this pre-history of early post-colonial state formation and development in the context of the unfolding Cold War, then that sheds light on the trajectory of the country after the 1990s, after the end of the so-called end of the Cold War and the collapse of the economy, and why North Korea did not follow either a Chinese or a Soviet path. And saw the emergence of its own quite sort of distinctive political economy. So I'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but one of the important questions here is then to understand what happened in the 1990s. And of course, we're not the first people to say that there was a shift towards marketization. I mean, in some sense, this was true of all the state socialist countries, but I think a lot of the literature on North Korea has understood this as a process from below, and it's looks at this as a process of the weakening of state control and an increasing private space in which citizens are able to sustain their livelihood separately from the state and achieve a certain degree of autonomy. Some even look at this, probably thinking about what happened in Eastern Europe as possibly a form of potential challenge to state power. So actually, marketization is also the emergence of a certain degree of civil society, you might say. But what we do in this book is we critique this notion of this kind of ontological, liberal ontological distinction between the state and the market, or between state and civil society, or more broadly, between the public and the private. And we argue that this is kind of, it comes to liberal theory, it's a kind of normative ideological conception that suggests that the distinction between public and private is the normal and necessary condition of a liberal polity. But what we do is we argue that, far from being a challenge to the state, marketization actually has become this kind of active goal that's pursued by the state as a means of securing its own existence. It is, of course, true that with the collapse of central planning in the 1990s, there was a grassroots response which formed the basis of marketization to a degree. So, the vast majority of North Koreans had almost no choice but to turn to market type activities. And this was the case with, private plots in terms of agriculture or engaging in forms of household production. Many started to engage in marketplace trade, trading food and clothes and daily necessities, household appliances. A lot of this was all sourced from China as well. So in that sense, marketization cannot really be separated from the geopolitical fact of the rise of China and how important the Sino-Korean trade became to marketization. But also we would say it cannot be separated by the state, from the state either. I mean, of course, the legal code in North Korea still does not permit various forms of private entrepreneurship. But you do see a similar situation to what you saw in China in the 1980s, which is what they called, Dai Hong Maozi, which is like wearing the red cap. So what happens in that situation is that you see the emergence of, in some sense, a mutually beneficial relationship between the private investors, the Tonju, and the state-owned enterprises. And for the state-owned enterprises, this means that they are able to gain access to the kind of capital and the materials that they need that are no longer available from the state central planning system. And then for the Tonju, the investors, they are able to negotiate the lack of private property rights, and through also by doing that achieve a certain degree of political protection. So it's a kind of mutual dependence. Now, of course, we're not the first people to argue this. I mean, it's been said many times in the literature on marketization, but I think what we want to emphasize is that this is not just simply a relationship that's emerged at the lower levels between local entrepreneurs and local regional sort of officialdom or enterprises, but it's really come to embrace the state from the bottom to the top, therefore challenging this this kind of distinction that's often made between the state and the market. I'll just explain how that relationship works in a few different sectors. I was also asked just to kind of provide some pictures, which I don't normally do, and I'm not a photographer, but anyway, they're there just to back up the point. So there's the service industries, of course. I mean, if you've been to North Korea in the last 10, 15 years, you will have seen the emergence all over the place, and not just in Pyongyang, but in the other cities of all kinds of service industries. So it was one of the areas where marketization expanded earliest and furthest. So you see it in terms of shops, in restaurants, public baths, beauty salons, coffee shops, nail salons, snooker halls, karaoke rooms, all these kind of things. They take the form of very small scale state-owned enterprises, but they are, of course, in reality kind of private enterprises. So it's the case of the investors borrowing the name of a state-owned enterprise and then in return paying a portion of their profits to that enterprise. We see it also in state-owned retail outlets as well. So previously, of course, these retail outlets sold goods under the central plan, but then that stopped in the 1990s. So increasingly, these kind of organizations receive investments from investors, and then they sell privately procured goods. And then also we have a similar situation. I think this in the last picture, they're all in from Changguan Street in the center of Pyongyang, but we see it also in restaurants as well, because restaurants also were kind of part of the state distribution system, but then with the process of marketization, then you get the kind of odd situation where restaurants will sell food that's both at state prices, but it's also, they have an area or certain foods that are sold in relation to these kind of relationships with the private investors. Yeah, so you get foods of different quality sold at different prices in the same restaurant. The place where this process is most visible is in the housing sector. So again, I mean, there's still no real private property rights in housing, but what happens is you have the trading of housing usage permits, what's known in Korean as 국가 사른집 리용 허가제. So these are kind of like the ownership rights or deeds to property, and basically it's the same as a property market. But then the point is, this then leads to a kind of very brisk construction sector. So again, it works on the relationship between state-owned enterprises and private investors. So the private investors will put forward the capital needed and often supply the materials, typically sourced from China, because the expense. I mean, many of these apartments are sold in advance. And because the production still nonetheless takes place under the auspices of a state-owned enterprise, that allows the authorities to present this as a kind of act of what the government is doing. Housing, as if you've seen the North Korean media, being a gift of the government to the people, that kind of thing. So we also see this in the transport sector as well. So obviously the 1990s had a devastating impact on the transport infrastructure. So particularly in the railway sector, partly because of the energy problems, but then in the place of that, you have the emergence of this kind of private stroke state transport network. It began with trucks originally transporting people and goods, known as Sobita, and then this definition was expanded towards a bus network. So typically, a private investor may purchase a bus from China, typically secondhand buses, and then but they have to be registered with state-owned enterprises or some form of state organ, and then it's run as a kind of profit-making kind concern. And then what that means is there's been a vast improvement in the internal domestic bus network in North Korea in recent years. And the point here is, of course, it plays an important role in marketization generally, because marketization, it's about logistics and all these kind of things. And that last point I could say also about the proliferation of taxes, which again, if you've been to North Korea in the last few years, I mean, they're certainly in Pyongyang, they're everywhere, but also in to some extent in other cities. But I should just say it's slightly different, because a lot of big state-owned enterprises have sort of entered the taxi business. So often with the taxes, you can see which state-owned enterprise is operating that, because it's a profitable business. For example, Air Koryo have started doing taxis, and even state-owned enterprises like Medium Riding Club, you know, which I mean, their primary concern should sort of be horses, right? But it's a profitable area, so they've also, you can see these taxis in Pyongyang as well. So what this means is basically that the economic status of the Tonju has risen a lot since the 1990s, but they've little choice to rely on the state, as I mentioned, and so they can only operate really within the limits of political power. But as I said, this is a mutual dependency. But we would also say that it goes further even than just this, and we can see several areas where the central state has been pushing for marketization, and we can't really understand the process of marketization without thinking about this role of the central state. I mean, the most obvious thing is the marketplaces, right? Sorry, these pictures on the left I didn't take, but this is Tongil Kori Sijang in Pyongyang, but there's just a general point that the general markets are not black markets or even gray markets. They are official legal marketplaces which are managed directly by the government, and it's where the majority of North Koreans actually get their daily goods from. So and the rationale for the state is the fees which traders have to pay, and so, you know, there's a calculation in the book that daily the central state gets anywhere up to about 250,000 US dollars in fees from these markets, and they're managed by local city and county people's committees. The other area is, of course, the mobile phone network, which by definition cannot be established without a central state role. And you know, but something 1 in 7, 1 in 6 North Koreans are now mobile phone users. And of course now it's all about smartphones. So I mean, the last time I was there, the first thing I noticed is that everybody's staring at their phone all the time because of the proliferation of smartphones. So it's just become just like anywhere else in that regard. So, but also, I mean, the point is that these mobile phones are an absolutely essential part of the whole process of marketization. It wouldn't simply be able to operate in the way it does without the mobile phone network. I should just say, I mean, I haven't said much more about the kind of international connections in all of this, but some of this marketization is also a result of joint ventures with foreign companies as well. So in case any of you have been to the Kwangbok department store, I mean, that's a joint venture with a Chinese company rather than with sort of domestic Tonju. And you can see here, I understand now that they've got rid of the Chinese writing on this, but still it's a very odd, it sounds strange in Korean. It sounds more like just a direct translation of the Chinese. It wouldn't be common to say sort of Sangop Chungsim, which is it's a direct translation of Shangye Zhongxin. But anyway, we do in the book, we have a whole chapter on Sino-North Korean trade and investment. So we do have quite a bit more to say about that. Now, so I guess the question that's often raised then about North Korea then is its direction of travel and whether it's likely to sort of converge along a kind of Chinese, Vietnamese style model. I've already alluded to the fact that I don't think that that's necessarily the case, but you know, and if we look at the process of reform in the country, I mean, I've already sort of, it's not the case that there hasn't been reform. Much of what I've been talking about are a result of reform measures. And in the 1980s, the early 2000s, and during the Kim Jong-un era, there have been all kinds of reforms. Now, I should just say that it is also quite limited in comparative terms. So there are several reasons why North Korean reform has been fairly cautious and conservative. I mean, the first one is obviously geopolitics. I mean, you know, quite a few people have said this, that given that North Korea still remains in the state of geopolitical standoff with the United States, the country remains in a state of hypervigilance. It's also a divided country, unlike China, Vietnam, right? So this doesn't create a very auspicious climate for reform. And if North Korea wishes to normalize its relations with the US in the way that China and Vietnam did, it actually has to give up the very cornerstone of its deterrence. So that's an obvious factor there. But I think what we also draw attention to is that, you know, sometimes we do obsess over the precise nature of the reform measures themselves, but actually there's this question about the very structural differences here. And this goes back to what I was talking about earlier on about the specific nature of North Korea's industrialized economy. Because of the way that the development geopolitics nexus has worked in the case of North Korea, North Korea's challenge is more one of structural adjustment than, say for example, approaching development for the first time in terms of a transition from a rural to an industrial economy, as you saw in 1980s China and Vietnam. So what that means is, first of all, that North Korea is a bit more, well, much more cautious in terms of reform. But also, if we do carry out similar reforms in North Korea, they're not going to have the same impact. So in that sense, North Korea is a bit more like sort of Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, in terms of the structural challenges of reform. And if we look at the literature on the sort of political economy of sectors, economic sectors, it is the case, whether it's a state socialist country or not, that if you have the dominance of a capital-intensive, technology-heavy sector, which with significant sunk costs, that means that you're likely to have a conservative attitude towards any kind of economic reform that might kind of upend that and lead to new economic sectors. A good example of where you can see this in action actually is in China, because China's northeast shares many characteristics with North Korea, and it makes sense really, because it kind of you know, it was part of the same historical legacy of you know, Japanese colonialism and that kind of thing. So after the reform period started in China, the dynamism was in the coastal areas, but in the northeast you had quite a sort of conservative attitude to reform. There was suspicion of foreign investment. And because of the whole product cycle of industrial investment, this kind of thing, it became one of the most kind of depressed regions in China, and still has a lot of economic difficulties and problems and low growth rates and this kind of thing. And so I think if Northeast China was a separate state, we'd see something quite a lot more similar to North Korea. But like I say, nonetheless, there are reforms taking place. So I just want to, last thing, I just want to talk a little bit about industrial reforms under Kim Jong-un, because I do think this sort of sheds light on the kind of direction of travel. There have been reforms in the industrial sector. They're known as the Socialist Enterprise Responsibility Management System. We know about the content because, unlike reforms in the past, these have actually been followed through in terms of legal revisions to the People's Economy Planning Law, the Enterprise Law, various other kinds of laws. And basically, in some sense, they are kind of typical market socialist measures, right? So in a state socialist country, I mean, you sort of decentralize decision-making rights, and you increase managerial and labor incentives through the increased use of market forces. So that's not really surprising. And in the North Korean case, this is also about scaling back the State Planning Commission and handing many more targets down to the enterprise level rather than trying to centralize everything. So it creates kind of new expectations on the part of state-owned enterprise managers. They're expected to come up with their own plans, make their own decisions about production, sales and financial management. That enterprises are now much more responsible for supporting their own employees. So this is a real departure then from the system that emerged in the 1960s, the Taean work method, which is kind of the flagship of the Kim Il-sung era. Suggests a bit more flexibility then than what we might normally expect in terms of the legacies of the Kim Il-sung era. And also, significantly, the laws now state that enterprises are allowed to receive investments from private investors. And you see something similar in the agricultural law as well. So even though private property and that kind of thing is still not explicitly permitted, but there is a recognition that the funds of the new capitalists, if you like, have some sort of legal status. But this also tells us something interesting about the state's market to the state's relationship to the market sector. Okay, so these measures are in some sense reactive and proactive, but they probably the socialist enterprise responsibility management system is applied particularly to sort of lower level enterprises, those in light industry, those in the provinces, those under kind of regional governance kind of organizations under their oversight. And these are the kind of enterprises that are much more likely to be integrated into the market. But at the same time, I mean, North Korea, if you read the North Korean Economics Journal, I mean, they're quite explicit that strategic industries are still, there's an intention that they're still part of the kind of state system, this, you might call it central planning system, or what's left of it. Okay, so it's part of these reforms are part of a kind of dualistic approach. And this also means that it's geographically uneven, right? Because much of the light industry, for example, are in the Pyongan provinces. But if you go to a province like Tagang province, it's mostly kind of strategic industries, particularly defense-related factories, hydropower stations, machine tools, that kind of thing. So the extent to which the state tolerates marketization is also geographically uneven as well. I mean, of course, between this, you do get kind of hybrid forms as well in terms of enterprises' extent of dependence on the market. But what this also means is there's kind of a kind of mutual dependence relationship there as well. So the state kind of extracts resources from the more marketized sector of the economy, and the intention is then to use those resources to support the strategic sector that it wants to support. I mean, this is not so much different to actually what happens in China, actually, because you still in China you have a huge state sector alongside a kind of a more private market-oriented sector that's integrated into global production networks. So it's dualistic as well, although of course in the North Korean case that sort of integration into global production is more limited, although I wouldn't say it was completely absent. But in any case, it would seem to me that what's distinctive about the North Korean case is that it kind of is trying to establish this kind of dualistic approach to the economy, the strategic alongside the market-oriented sector. And I won't go into it in any more detail now, but we can see that as being a result of the kind of path-dependent aspects of North Korea's developmental history. So anyway, I think I've spoken probably a bit too long there, so I'll stop there. And just the final thing I would say, I mean, academic publishing, it's referred to as glacial for a reason, right? And by the time it goes into publication, it's, things happen, and there's been discussions recently about whether the state is trying to establish control back over the economy. So I'd be happy to pick up some of those issues in the Q&A, but I will stop there now and listen to some questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Gray. And in the interest of time, because we like to have a lot of discussion from the audience, I'll just skip my discussion of the book and just ask you two questions. First question is, you touched briefly that Jangmadang, unlike the dominant scholarly discourse, is more of a partnership between the state and the private sector, and actually is more led by the state rather than marketization below. But having said that, can we not at least perhaps in the future expect that however limited they are, Jangmadangs can actually play some role in bringing, consciously or not, some sort of social change within local society in the longer term, not immediate term, but let's say 2 or 3 decades time. And secondly, how do you assess the future prospect of development geopolitical nexus? The approach, I think, is very innovative to assess North Korea's situation in the age of Sino-US bipolarity. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so on the first question, I think when you refer to Jangmadang, I think you're not referring to necessarily the physical space, but the actual fact of North Korean people's increased dependence on market activities rather than simply being recipients of the public distribution system. So I think, yeah, I don't see any contradiction between that, what you're suggesting, and the fact that the state and the market are sort of mutually dependent in certain ways. I wouldn't want to exaggerate it too much, because I think it depends who we're talking about. So when we refer to Tonju, we're thinking about these are people who've really accumulated a lot of capital, and they are sort of like if you like, the top end of the entrepreneurial class, right? They're the ones who are sort of involved in significant state projects and all this kind of thing, and they are very much dependent on the state. So I think at that level, I'm skeptical about whether this is some kind of future form of opposition to the North Korean regime. But I think when you start to get down to the lower levels, I mean, people have argued. I'm trying to remember who now, but that it is the case that as people reduce their dependence on say political factors, for example, and become much more dependent on their own skills in terms of trading, then they develop their own interests, and also they become much more likely to resist against the infringement upon their rights to trade, particularly when it affects their livelihood. I think that's the case. I still think, comparatively though, I mean, the process itself is not so different to what's happened, say, for example, in China and Vietnam, okay, where there has also been a process of marketization following a period of for, you know, sort of more classic state socialism. So I think in that regard, I mean, there's nothing wrong in thinking about people being more vocal and more active in defending themselves, but I still think it would be a bit unrealistic, personally, to my view, to think that this is going to develop into any kind of, you know, organized resistance or something like that. I think that's unlikely. Although you know, popular protest, things like that, is by its nature quite sort of difficult to predict and difficult to theorize. So so yeah, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's quite a speculative one. But yeah, I mean I think obviously it's if we compare North Korea now to the era of sort of classic state socialism, there's much more scope for, you know, this kind of perhaps collective subjectivity in distinction from the state to emerge, and at least for people to resist any kind of infringement on the rights. So that's one thing. And your other question was about thinking about U.S.-China rivalry. Is that correct? Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
And what?
So we are currently living in a new era, I would argue, the Sino-US hegemonic rivalry, especially in the Asia-Pacific region. And I'm just wondering, because you touched on development, geopolitics nexus as an analytical approach, which I think is very important. I'm just wondering, of course, no one can predict the future, but I'm just thinking, since we can look in the past and look at how North Korea managed to balance its independence between China and Soviet Union, and scholars have drawn lessons from that. So I'm just wondering, what would be the fate of North Korean economy in the years to come, now that there are two arguably superpowers on the horizon? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a difficult question, but I think obviously, as the U.S.-China rivalry has intensified, that's created more opportunity for North Korea to, I guess, in some ways, revert to the pattern of the past, where it's sort of able to really just kind of muddle through its kind of existing economic relations with China, and I mean, it looked a bit touch and go for a while, you know, in the sort of mid 2010s, where it looked like, and particularly from 2017, that China was, you know, increasingly unhappy about North Korea's actions, because it was creating responses. You know, I mean, it was North Korea's nuclear development and this kind of thing, and was causing like THAAD to be deployed in South Korea, and then this was not North Korea's traditional role as a kind of buffer state. It seemed to be losing that role. But then now we see, with the intensification of the US-China relationship, I think there's a that sort of somewhat traditional relationship is starting to reemerge, and I think there's more scope for North Korea. I mean, of course, this you know, the COVID-19 thing in this year sort of, you know, adds a very different picture to that. But if we view that as temporary, then I think we can say that there's likely to be some kind of reversion. But of course, China is one element of that. But through China, I mean, North Korea is still kind of integrated into broader production networks. I mean, I've just written a paper recently on clothing production, for example, which was North Korea's largest growing export in the 2010s, and because of the nature of global production networks, the North Korean clothing was ending up everywhere, in South Korea and Europe and all over the place. So it was it's not purely a bilateral relationship, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your answer. So we
Hmm.
have a question from Mr. Colin McCullough. Would you like to ask a question to Professor Gray, please?
Yes, thank you. Colin McCulloch. I'm, as you know, Kevin, normally at Poost, but I'm stuck in Sheffield in England at the moment.
Oh.
That's life, isn't it, at the moment?
Yeah.
Still teaching, though, online. It's wonderful. My question really was in relation to the parallels with China, and perhaps more, rather than the historic review, which I found very interesting and helpful, actually, thank you, but more the current state of the art, setting COVID aside, and perhaps setting sanctions aside to some degree at least. And the role of foreign direct investment. And in the Chinese parallel, I think a lot of the narratives about China are that it was the foreigners came with technology and money. I think that's actually considerably exaggerated, but that's another argument. But do you think the North Koreans are, well, what is the question really is about country risk? Because I've heard at least anecdotes of people who've opened mines or other operations and basically could never extract any return from their investment because it was always in some way locked, misappropriated either by a Dongju partner or by government in some way. And I wondered if you could comment on the role of FDI and the risks around FDI.
Okay. I mean, I think we've all heard these stories, particularly when investments go wrong, and then there's a great deal of attention paid to them, and I think that is a real risk for any foreign investor, and foreign investors will invest in North Korea if they're prepared to sort of lose money. I mean, this is what the South Korean chaebol did, right? You know, Hyundai. I mean, it was part of their business plan. I mean, that was you know, they have various different levels of the amount of risk that they're able to kind of put up with. So yeah, I think that's an issue. But you know, again, comparatively, if we look at the early stages of foreign investment in China, it was often done through sort of overseas Chinese capital as kind of intermediators, because back in the 80s, I mean, it was the same. You know, everybody was saying, well, you know, you invest in China. I mean, there's no proper protection for your investments. You know, it's the rules are unclear. You really need good connections and good language skills and all this kind of thing. And basically, a lot of the time it was you know, Hong Kong based or maybe Southeast Asian Taiwanese based capital that would sort of be the intermediary between the foreign, you know, say, for example, Western capital, Japanese capital, and China. So, and I think we can sort of see that taking place in Northeast China as well. So Chinese investment in North Korea is obviously the most significant form of foreign investment, and it's usually quite sort of small scale Chinese capital, particularly private capital, that will invest in North Korea. And so, as you know, I was just saying earlier, in terms of production networks, production can take place in North Korea, but there will be certain, you know, it's quite an opaque and stretched out sort of production network there. So, I mean, I gave clothing as an example. So, I think from North Korea's perspective, you know, I mean that works. I mean that's a way that they can produce for overseas markets, and it reduces some of the risk. And it's, at least until maximum pressure, that was kind of working reasonably well, and it was providing employment to North Koreans and all this kind of thing. I mean, I guess what you're talking about is a bit more sort of grand scale, you know, investment directly into North Korea without going through these kind of northeastern sort of Chinese networks and things like that, which obviously, I mean, the reputational risk. I mean, well, North Korea doesn't really have a reputation for being a good site for foreign investment. I think there's very few to understate it massively. But yeah, but that doesn't mean it can't happen. As I say, there are other routes for that. These kind of intermediary Chinese capital can play that role.
Right. Thank you. So next question is from Eliza Eliza, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, St. Bill. Thank you, Professor Gray, for this very interesting talk today. It's not every day we have a presentation on the geopolitics of North Korea. It might be a very difficult question to answer because it's so brand new, but what do you think the impact of COVID will have on the geopolitics of development in North Korea? Is the marketization enough to maintain the development?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the impact of COVID has been extremely negative in North Korea. That's not really a surprise, and that's related to the fact that they've closed off their border with China, which I mean, in some sense, it's understandable given the state of their healthcare system that they would do that. I mean, they did that with Ebola before, and that was a much more distant threat. But so I mean, as I said, marketization and the Sino-North Korean trade are kind of interlinked in a way. So if you close off the border, that is going to impact on market activity in the country. And most of the reports suggest that's exactly what's happened, and market activity has declined. In terms of North Korean policy response, there's been a discussion sort of recently with the party congress and the plenary sessions of the Central Committee of the Korean Workers' Party, where it seems now, at least in rhetoric, the North Korean government is really pushing this kind of self-reliance path, message a great deal, and also putting forward this kind of intention to re-establish government control over the economy. Now, I'm not really sure what they mean exactly by that. I mean, what are they referring to when they're saying they want to re-establish control over the economy? I mean, surely that doesn't mean re-establishing the central planning system, because I just don't think they could. And so we have to think that, well, the North Korean government may say one thing, but can it actually deliver, and can it do that? This has been the challenge, actually, that they've been faced with for the past 20 years or 30 years, actually, since the collapse of the economy. So most scholars who have looked at North Korea have said that marketization is an irreversible process. That's not because they think Kim Jong-un is a complete convert to Milton Friedman or neoliberal economics or anything, but it's simply because the North Korean state cannot really function in the way that it sort of it did before the 1990s. Most workers, for example, don't get paid proper salaries by the North Korean state. Okay, so and the North Korean state cannot supply capital and materials to its enterprises. If it wants to re-establish state control, it's going to have to sort those problems out, and I don't think it would be able to. I don't think it can. So I think de facto marketization, even though it's taken a big hit because of the economic crisis at the moment, is I still think nonetheless those kind of dynamics that make it an irreversible process are likely to continue. So I think we need to take a sort of a grain of salt with what we hear coming from the top leadership in North Korea, and just because they say that that's the direction they want the economy to go. And actually, one example, I mean, late 2000s, there was all this talk about re-establishing the public distribution system and repressing marketization, and they actually closed all the markets, but it was a complete disaster because they weren't able to re-establish the public distribution system, but also that attempt to repress the market actually had a really negative impact on state-owned enterprises, because state-owned enterprises were dependent on the market, and so if you can't kind of establish an alternative, then it's not going to happen. So yeah, sorry, that was quite a long answer to your question, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. The next question is I'll read out to you is from Trong Hiep Gwen. Sorry for my pronunciation. So his question is, how do you see the role of COVID vaccine in enhancing China's soft power? Yeah, thank you.
To be honest, don't, I can't really provide a good answer to that question. I think, I mean, I don't really know the details of the vaccine program and exactly what form that's taken. Chinese soft power in general. I mean, I'm a bit skeptical about the whole notion of Chinese soft power. More generally, but I think in North Korea, yeah, I just can't really see how that would work or what role that would play. I mean, and I think North Korea generally does have a long-standing fear of being overly dependent on China in terms of trade and investment and all these kind of things. I mean, it speaks to North Korea's current predicament. But also, I mean, North Korea is not alone in this. I mean, if you look at most of the countries around China's periphery, I mean, they all have similar kind of fears of economic dominance as well. So I think because of that, I mean, Chinese soft power is not. It's just not something I've really thought about in regards to North Korea, and I don't think it's so much of a sort of analytical issue to speak of. So. I think, and I think this kind of concern about potential Chinese economic dominance is always there, and I think personally I think it's one of the reasons why there is a possibility for a diplomatic opening with North Korea, because I think normalization of relations with the US, obviously the whole question is about what are the conditions for that, but in any case, I mean that's a kind of precondition for a diversification of North Korea's foreign relations. But yeah, but apart from that, yeah, I can't really say more on vaccine diplomacy and soft power.
Right, thank you. The next question is from Xie Hui. Yeah, Xie Hui, ask your question, please.
Thank you, Professor Gary, for your presentation. My question is also something you are not talking about in this presentation, but it's related to economy. So the US-China had fought very intensively on the trade war, and then the trade war, the essential part of the trade war is about technology rivalry, the artificial intelligence, 5G. So you are talking about the political economy in North Korea and those transnational cooperation between North Korea, China, and the US, especially on its clothing production. So I'm wondering, what's the role of artificial intelligence and then other high technologies played in the development of North Korea's economy? Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I mean, what I can say is, if we look at what has been driving North Korea's integration into the regional economy in the past 15, 20, 25 years, it's mostly sort of driven by quite simple forms of production, right? I mean, the big thing is mineral exports, okay? So in that sector particularly, technology is not a big kind of driving factor. I mean, the same with clothing production and things like that. It's kind of, resource-based or labor-intensive manufacturing and things like that. So in terms of North Korea's integration into the regional system, then I would say not so much. But it is the case. I mean, North Korea, obviously, I mean, the paradox of North Korea it was once referred to as the poorest advanced economy in the world, right? Which, I think it's a really good term in a sense, in a sense that, okay, it is one of the poorest countries in the world, but nonetheless, it has all these very developed, universities and institutions, research institutes and things like that. I mean, how else do they actually have a country at North Korea's level of sort of standard of living normally would not be able to develop its own mostly or significantly homegrown nuclear and missile system and all this kind of thing. But even other things, I mean, things like labor dispatch overseas. I mean, that's another way that North Korea has been integrated. So they've been sending, of course, lots of workers. I mean, lots of them, it's in sort of manual work or sort of low to semi-skilled work, but they also send lots overseas, lots of IT workers and things like that. So in China, Northeast China, in IT companies, they get sort of North Korean IT specialists as well. I mean, it's not a massive scale, but it just shows that in many respects they are the technology there is and research and development is quite a bit more developed than what you would sort of typically expect. So there is, and that's obviously an area there's a lot of scope for future development, and the state itself, particularly in recent years, really does place a lot of rhetorical emphasis on science and technology. Okay, and it's, I was talking about the socialist economic responsibility management system, and there, if you look at the legal codes, I mean, they're continuously emphasizing the development of science and technology, and that's also considered a means also which they can pursue this goal, which I think is somewhat ill-advised but perhaps understandable, of self-reliance and reducing dependence on imports. But yeah, that's what I have to say about that.
Right. Thank you. Next question is from Han Sung-yun. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Gray. Thank you for your presentation. My question is related with the COVID-19 also. I'd like to ask you, there is, I mean, the North Korea's isolationism is become really stronger after COVID-19. For example, they decreased the trade between North Korea and China recently, and we also can simply imagine that it will take really long time to North Korea to escape from this COVID-19 crisis. So I want to ask you how COVID-19 crisis will influence North Korean geopolitics or the economic situation inside.
I mean, yeah, I mean, they took a very drastic step in terms of closing the borders, basically, and even closing all kinds of trade. So the question is how long they can keep this up, really. I mean, I don't think they can actually just wait it out until COVID-19 just disappears or everybody's vaccinated. I just can't really see how. I mean, all I can say on that, I mean, I've seen reports, and sometimes based on rumors, and they might not be substantiated, but there seems to be an expectation that there will be some opening of the border in the next few months, simply because it's just causing so much disruption. I mean, and it's just all these economic plans. I mean, the new 5-year strategy, puts a lot of emphasis on electricity production and on chemicals and typical kind of the same sort of basic industries that they've been talking about for years, but they're not going to be able to actually achieve those goals without importing parts and what they need, materials from China. So I just don't see how they can actually continue to maintain the situation of a complete blockade. It's self-reliance. I mean, self-reliance itself is just not really an achievable goal, I don't think. They will need to open up trade. I mean, maybe it will be partial, that kind of thing. But I do think the country is in a real crisis situation at the moment, and it's not. There's going to be no degree of returning back to the past without reestablishing trade with China. That's pretty much what I have to say to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Any more questions or comments, please?
A couple of comments, if I may.
Yeah, please.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. I haven't really got any questions. I think, though, that one point I would make is that although there is theoretically a complete ban on contacts with China, there is some evidence that those go on. The fact that fuel for vehicles and so on is flowing in North Korea is an indication that it's still coming in from China, or some, I think, maybe from other places. And these stories of ships at sea that are exchanging oil cargoes and things like that. But I agree that eventually they will have to open up. But they will do it very cautiously for the very reason you mentioned. I mean, the health service is not able to cope with ordinary illnesses and diseases very well. Faced with a major thing like COVID, it would be in real trouble, I think. And they locked down during the, as you mentioned, Ebola, but also amongst the SARS, during the SARS epidemic and during the Middle East respiratory epidemic. So I think the ability to suffer seems, that's not quite the right word, but to tolerate immense deprivation seems to be very strong. Whether that will last forever, I don't know. The idea that North Korea was a leading economy back in the 1950s, I think, was endorsed by Joan Robertson, who was a famous economist at Cambridge, a left-leaning economist. But I think she first of all put North Korea on the map from that point of view. And having looked at various things over the years, until the early 1980s, the CIA was still saying, not necessarily publicly, but still saying privately, that the North Korean economy was stronger than the South Korean one, even though it had been by that stage, it had been certainly in decline for 10, 15 years or so. But, one was coming up, but the other was going down, but they hadn't actually, one hadn't overtaken the other at that stage. One of the sad things I do remember seeing was the Taean industrial complex, where Kim Il-sung gave his on-the-spot guidance on the introduction of the system. Well, I saw it years ago now, about 2001 or 2002, but there were trees growing out of the buildings, and it was derelict, and so there was one of the flagships of the whole system gone to pieces. And of course, over on the East Coast, in those days, you drove up from Wonsan to Hamhung and north, and it was a ghost land. It was dead completely. Just one point on their ability to imitate or to go down the Chinese path. Well, the trouble is with that is that they did that in the 1950s and 60s. They squeezed agriculture to make the funds to be able to develop and build up their industrial base, which was already there. It come from the Japanese, damaged very badly, ran down very badly in the Pacific War, damaged very badly in the Korean War, quite deliberately. I mean, shelling from the sea off Hamhung did tremendous damage, never mind the air attacks and so on. So they went through all that, and to somehow think they can do it again is, I think, it's lacking knowledge of what North Korea has been through and is like. So, but I think it's a very interesting presentation. It looks like a very interesting book.
Right. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think I mean, you mentioned the ability to suffer, but then you retracted it. But I know what you mean. And I think it's something. It's an interesting factor about the Kim Jong-un government, because I think the legitimacy basis of the Kim Jong-un era was very, very much based on improved living standards. And the fact, I mean, Kim Jong-un is a sort of, 3 generations removed now, and the nobody even heard of him, just a few years before he came to power. And so much of the sort of imagery and the rhetoric of the North Korean media was about, enjoying the fruits of socialism and also part of that, enjoying the kind of the trappings of modernity that people know is everybody else has, in China and South Korea. I mean, the North Koreans are not ignorant, and they know what's going on elsewhere in the world. So much of it, this was based on kind of this idea that life was getting better for everyone, and so that's why I think this, the political sort of side of what's taking place now is so such a challenge for the government, for the regime. Yeah, so it's a very different situation to the 1990s, I think, which was obviously, I mean, much worse in many ways. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, another one from Mr. McClough. Yeah, please.
Great. Yeah, thank you. If I might interject a couple of comments, I would just want to second Jim's remarks about the industrial development post-Korean War being like what China did, because that was the moving of that's the 2-sector model of industrial development, if you want to take it very simply, that you move agricultural workers into the cities and into the industry. And they can't do that again because they haven't got the spare labor. They haven't got hundreds of thousands of peasants who are underutilized in the countryside, unless agriculture was radically industrialized in a way that would take huge amounts of capital, which is precisely what they haven't got, financial capital. But what they have got is human capital for the Industrial Revolution 4 or whatever it's called now. The Internet of Things, software people, and so on. Some of these are our students at Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. No, we're not training them to do hacking, by the way, in case anybody wants to ask. Jim knows that well. That's always the accusation. No, we're training them to do networks and software and databases and things like this. And I think they do have an opportunity there, as well as what Kevin rightly said in terms of the resource exploitation, whatever it is they've got in those mountains, and the low-level manufacturing, being another Vietnam because China's now too expensive and so on. Yeah, I think that's the way that we have to think in terms of possible development. But at the moment, just to give you some current information, I'm probably not at liberty to tell you everything, but we are teaching remotely to our students using videos and online sessions, and they are under severe lockdown. It's not just the borders, the whole country is under very severe public movement restrictions, much more than normal, not just limited to your city or something. You're limited to your residence or something like that. I think that's what our students are actually experiencing, and they are from the middling to upper class group. They're not the top elite, but they're from the middling upper intellectual classes. So if they're suffering at that level, in their institutions, then, you know, people, ordinary people, I'm sure, are even more so. Yeah. On top of which, they've had 2 years of bad harvests and the World Food Programme just pulling out because they can't communicate. So not good, actually, practically speaking. Yeah. Thank you.
That's interesting, because I remember earlier on, I mean, there were some were arguing that in North Korea lockdown wouldn't work very well because you know, bribery and corruption is widespread, and travel restrictions never really work and that kind of thing. But it does sound from what you're saying that no, that's not actually the case. That,
well, of course, I'm only sharing an anecdote from one window that I've got into the country, and we don't have the other sources really, because most of the diplomats have pulled out, the foreign NGO and UN people, the aid program people have pulled out pretty much. There's only like literally a couple of handfuls of at least Western foreigners still on site, I think, in Pyongyang, leave alone any other parts of the country.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. And unfortunately, in the interest of time, I don't think we can take more questions or comments, but our chair of Korean Studies, Professor Youngmi Kim, wants to have some few words. So yeah, Professor Kim.
I just wanted to say thank you to Kevin and all the audience joining, especially to Kevin contributing your lecture, and your book is definitely going to be our textbook for North Korean sessions. So congratulations to you.
Thank you.
And before we end, I wanted to introduce, actually I put it in the chatting box. We recently launched Edinburgh Forum on Korea, and Dr. Jim Ho also contributed the first article already in the link. You can read it. We also have a cultural section with the first, we also had a lecture series with a poet, Cheon-mi. Her poem, Poetry to the Pig, is uploaded already. And we also have Bang No-hae's poetry is going to be uploaded in mid-March. I see a lot of specialists also experience living in North Korea here. If you are interested in contributing your paper, please do so. Your paper is always welcome. We do have a bit of review, procedure, but you're very welcome. That's it. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Youngmi. So before we formally end, I would like to thank Professor Gray once again for his very enlightening lecture. I'm sorry that I couldn't discuss deeply about your book because it has not been published. So I'm sorry about that. And for next week, March 3rd, the next lecture will be given by Professor Sharon J. Yoon, professor at the University of Notre Dame. And just like today, she's going to discuss the book, The Cost of Belonging. And this book will discuss experiences of Koreans, Korean Chinese, and Korean students living in Beijing's Koreatown. So for those of you who are interested in Korean studies, Chinese studies, migration, identity, transnational capital, etc., please join next week as well. Yeah, thank you very much for your attending and questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.